The end of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan may be the beginning of a new and expanding threat.
There is a commonality of purpose there. Pakistanis, Afghanis, Iraqis, Lebanese, others, Iranian leaders have been very open about their intent to use those foreign fighters.
This week from Israel, a look at what might be considered a new axis of evil and how the United States is facing a new terrorist danger.
Puerto Rico has faced recent disasters and an electric system requiring billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to fix.
The biggest single lump sum of money that had gone out the door as of about 2019 was $5 billion for the electric grid. What happened to that money?
Spent on a system now said to be on the verge of collapse.
People don't have any high expectations in general.
What's unusual about the Coast Guard being here? This is not something they've traditionally done.
It is a little unusual.
And we take you on an unusual mission for the U.S. Coast Guard, triggered by the border crisis. Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. The botched U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is having a far-reaching impact. Some experts say it's fostering a new axis of state-sponsored terrorism made up of Afghanistan's Taliban rulers and the Islamic extremists in Iran and Pakistan. That's creating new threats for their prime target, Israel, and impacting America's strategic position in the Mideast. Scott Thuman has today's cover story from Israel.
Embedded with the Israeli Defense Force in the far north of the country, I sit next to a soldier, automatic weapon at the ready. These idyllic hills, the setting recently for a dangerous escalation.
Sadly, Hezbollah continues to roam these areas freely, build their rockets, stockpile them, put them in houses right next to schools.
Just days before arriving, and for the first time in 15 years, the Lebanese terror group Hezbollah fired 19 rockets into the area, Israel retaliating from the land and sky. Their sights set on the Islamic extremist military and political group opposing Israel and Western powers operating here. From the top of Mount Dove, some 3,000 feet above sea level, Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Scheffler unravels the threat matrix.
It has a lot to do with Iran. Iran is the sponsor for Hezbollah. Iran continues to bring the precision-guided missiles know-how and capabilities, and that is something that we're trying to stop.
Flanked by Muslim nations, Israel is the only country in the Middle East where Islam is not the majority faith. This nation of 9 million, where nearly 75% of the population identifies as Jewish, under constant threat of attack from proxies entrenched in Gaza, a Palestinian territory dominated by the militant group Hamas, who aspire to destroy Israel and create an Islamic state in its place. And the West Bank, controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but it is also Israeli occupied, with scores of Jewish settlements adding to the conflict. All of it intensifying disputes that have also led to years of Muslim suicide bombings on Jewish targets. Ever since, the U.S. has provided Israel with $146 billion in foreign aid, mostly in military support, which in turn gives the U.S. real influence and a strategic stronghold in the Middle East, maybe more important than ever after pulling out of Afghanistan and creating a void terror groups can fill. Solidifying that partnership is the U.S.-backed Iron Dome, a missile defense system funded by $1.6 billion American taxpayer dollars since its creation 10 years ago, knocking out almost 90% of militant rockets fired out of the sky. In Washington, Congress, for the first time in years, is passionately fighting over U.S. funding to Israel.
We cannot be talking only about Israelis' need for safety at a time when Palestinians are living under a violent apartheid system.
I cannot allow one of my colleagues to stand on the floor of the House of Representatives and label the Jewish democratic state of Israel an apartheid state. I reject it.
As another nation, Iran continues to open its wallet here in Israel.
Iranians today, their influence is mainly focused on the Hamas. They supply the Palestinians money, for example, $10 billion each year to the military wing of Hamas.
Dr. Michael Milstein, former head of the Israeli military's Department for Palestinian Affairs, explains that Iran advances its ambitions by readily bankrolling militant Palestinians.
You can feed a lot of people in Gaza with this money. You can build a lot of water pipes in Gaza, but today Hamas prefer to build rockets.
Look, at the end of the day, Hamas is an integral part of the Palestinian political reality. We don't deny that.
I sat down with Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh in their capital of Ramallah, where he pushed back against Israeli occupation.
The Israelis, they employed quite a number of mechanisms of control against us. Military occupation, settler colonialism, control over water resources, control of our natural resources, including land. Even though this is the country where we have 310 days of sun, so we are not allowed to build solar energy, as we have been saying about Afghanistan and others. Security measures don't solve problems. Military measures don't solve problems.
200 miles south of the Golan Heights, I go to Jerusalem, to the seat of the Israeli government, where I meet Sharon Haskell, a member of the governing body known as the Knesset, who is sounding the alarm.
Well, we were extremely concerned about Iran. We've seen how they've been expanding in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in many areas. I mean, they're literally attacking the American embassy and American military bases. I mean, you have to be bold and secure to do something like that.
Furthering the concerns now, Iran is said to be within a month of having enough material for a nuclear weapon, prompting President Biden's call to action.
The United States remains committed to preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon.
Biden under pressure to revive the 2015 controversial Iran nuclear deal, brokered under President Obama but severed by President Trump.
There's an international, let's call it, interest in bringing them to some kind of an agreement. But unfortunately, it never works with violent, aggressive dictatorship. It never worked. It will not work.
Under President George W. Bush, the so-called axis of evil comprised of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Now, some 20 years later, there's a new axis of state-sponsored terror in the region, of shared interest between the Islamic militant Taliban regime in Afghanistan and the leadership of U.S. adversaries Pakistan and Iran. Some fear the three could align to endanger anyone it calls an enemy. So is that a fair assessment to kind of call this other axis of evil in some respects when it comes to terror?
There is a commonality of purpose there. Pakistanis, Afghanis, Iraqis, Lebanese, Iranian leaders have been very open about their intent to use those foreign fighters.
Dr. Matthew Levitt of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy just testified before Congress on the changing threat of violent extremism.
If you are a country that is on Iran's blacklist, like the United States, like Israel, then these militants have got to be a concern for you.
And just days ago in Washington, a stark warning from Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid should Iran not cooperate.
There are moments when nations must use force to protect the world from evil. If a terror regime is going to acquire a nuclear weapon, we must act. Israel reserves the right to act at any given moment in any way. That is not only our right, it is also our responsibility.
In August, Biden met with Israel's new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, but wouldn't commit in front of the cameras how far the U.S. is willing to go.
But we're putting diplomacy first and seeing where that takes us. But if diplomacy fails, we're ready to turn to other options.
In Nazareth, Amichai Chikli, former Israeli military commander elected to the Knesset, says the next few months will be critical.
Netanyahu and Trump brought Iran on her knees, destroyed their economy, and they made Iran weaker. And the nuclear deal that Obama's new ancestors are planning will bring Iran back again as a power.
You think that a Biden administration is going to have to be much, much tougher on Iran?
When you have a vicious regime, there is no room for being nice or being naive.
So do people think that Iran will come back to the negotiating table?
Well, there was some renewed hope of that with a new Iranian president because they would love to have those U.S.-imposed sanctions removed. But members of Israel's government that I spoke to, both current and former, they say that outlook is grim. They believe Iran is more focused on acquiring a nuclear weapon because that would give them unparalleled leverage.
Important information. Thanks a lot, Scott. Ahead on Full Measure, you might be shocked to hear the state of Puerto Rico's energy system after billions of American tax dollars were devoted to fixing it. Puerto Rico has dealt with its share of disasters in recent years. You may know its entire energy grid also qualifies as something of a disaster. Now, despite billions of U.S. tax dollars, there's concern the system is on the verge of a total collapse, prompting the U.S. territory to declare a state of emergency. Hurricanes Maria and Irma destroyed most of Puerto Rico's power system in 2017. But it wasn't much to begin with.
Maria was essentially a huge wake-up call.
Manuel Leboy heads up the island's central office for recovery, reconstruction, and resiliency.
You've had many hurricanes before, but that was the one that seemed to really trigger this realization that we'd better fix all of this.
So it is kind of a blessing in disguise, certainly. The silver lining opportunity is that we went through a very, very tough time. It cost us a lot, including lives. And moving forward, looking forward, now we have the chance to address something that we knew that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's something that we needed to address.
With Puerto Rico in bankruptcy, a financial oversight board approved hiring an American-Canadian consortium called Luma Energy to deliver on the island's energy makeover. The company took the reins June 1st. But before that, billions of your tax dollars had already gone toward Puerto Rico's electric grid through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. It was part of the most expensive disaster relief effort in U.S. history. Don Cortez is a Luma executive.
The biggest single lump sum of money that had gone out the door as of about 2019 was $5 billion for the electric grid. What happened to that money?
It was put into what was the emergency repairs after Maria. So that's where that money went. Then FEMA allocated $10 billion, which is what we're now going to spend on upgrading the grid. So the $5 billion went to just the emergency repairs, paying the contractors that came, whatever equipment they used, and poles, whatever they did to restore service at the time. What the new allocation from FEMA is $10 billion. That's going to upgrade the grid.
Cortez says updating doesn't mean burying the power lines, but building modern concrete, steel, and composite poles that can hold up under an average 160-mile-an-hour winds. They're also doing major conversions to solar, wind, and battery sources.
People don't have any high expectations in general about what's going to come about from Luma.
Alberto Martinez, a history professor at the University of Texas at Austin, was born in Puerto Rico and has analyzed its many phases.
The main impression on the island is that prices will go up. They're already projected to go up from roughly 20 cents in the past 2 years per kilowatt hour to 30 cents. So that's going to be a 30% increase. In terms of the improvement of services, the popular impressions are split because there are so many people who were grossly dissatisfied with the world-class disaster that was our electric company and its perennial mismanagement, that they do see some hope in having this, American-Canadian firm, combination of these two firms come in and try to do things in a different way.
LUMA's already been hit with a negative review. An early analysis claims the company's first months of service were marred by delays, damages, and poor service, which LUMA denies. After a fourth hike in their electric bills this year, residents began taking to the streets in protest. At a recent congressional hearing, Puerto Rican power officials described matters as critical.
The system was repaired after the hurricane, but not restored.
That's why it's so critical that we continue on with repairs on generation and repairs and restoration on transmission.
Meantime, the entire project is operating in the shadow of a corruption scandal. After Maria, the FBI charged 2 FEMA officials in a bribery scheme. They allegedly steered $1.8 billion to a company called Cobra Acquisitions to repair Puerto Rico's electric grid. The head of Cobra was also charged.
One of the biggest corruption cases had to do with the contract for electric stuff. So what's your comment on that?
There's quite a bit of overview and control over this, where you're going to spend the money by FEMA, by the local government, and by the regulator. All of this has to be approved before you spend it, and then you have to prove how you spend it and prove that you did spend it where you say you spend it.
How long, according to your plans, is it going to take before you have really big, meaningful change?
I would say that it's going to take 5 to 10 years to make a very, very big difference. Now, there are going to be people ask me, well, I might have to wait 5 years. No, we're going to be making a difference every day that we're here. We make a difference. But when you say a big difference, I would say it's going to take 5 to 10 years. We're trying to prudently and recently spend $10 billion.
And then in 10 years, if all goes well, if a big hurricane rips through here, what will happen?
2 things will happen. Number one, it'll be far less damage. There will always damage from a hurricane because of the strong winds and tornadoes and things like that. But number one, there'll be much less damage. Number 2, we're going to have the manpower to quickly restore service here, equivalent to any best restoration of utilities in the mainland.
LUMA gets paid not on electricity sold, but through a management fee amounting to close to $1 billion over 15 years. That brings the total investment in Puerto Rico's energy grid to somewhere north of $17 billion for an island the size of Connecticut. Coming up on Full Measure, we'll take you to a place the Coast Guard rarely goes and explain why they're there. When I recently reported from the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas, I saw one thing I hadn't seen there before: the Coast Guard. Lieutenant Tim Dion is the deployable team leader for the Maritime Safety and Security Team for the Coast Guard in New Orleans, but we found him on the Rio Grande.
Hey, be advised, we're coming alongside. And the mission of the Coast Guard down here is primarily search and rescue for the non-citizens that may be coming over from the Mexican side. And then our secondary mission is to provide surveillance for Border Patrol.
What's unusual about the Coast Guard being here? This is not something they've traditionally done.
So it is a little unusual. However, we fall under the Department of Homeland Security, and so whenever the Department of Homeland Security needs us to do any sort of mission that can fall under the Coast Guard's jurisdiction, such as being in the maritime domain, we're going to be there to do that.
Did the Homeland Security call up the Coast Guard in what time period and ask them to do what?
So Border Patrol, they put out the initial request asking for assistance with the overload of non-citizens that are coming over from Mexico. They put that up to Department of Homeland Security, and then DHS tells the Coast Guard to send extra assets here to assist.
What's a typical thing that the Coast Guard crew might see going up and down the Rio Grande?
So we will see a lot of people on the Mexican side, and those may be civilians, farmers, anybody on that side. By that same token, we will see a lot of non-citizens that are trying to come over to the American side. And whether that's in the form of them crossing the river, or that may be them on the banks and us deterring them from coming over.
And what is your job to do if you see that?
So if we see people coming across in rafts, if we determine that those rafts are unsafe, or if they're struggling to get across, if they don't have a paddle or something like that, we're here to help them out and make sure that everyone stays safe.
And you bring them across, or you send them back?
No, so if they make it across, then we notify Border Patrol, and they'll have somebody on the American side to apprehend them once they get over.
Out in America, there's a huge sentiment that protect our border.
Sure.
And they're kind of disappointed in sometimes that the agents here end up doing a lot of social work and rescue and helping people who put their lives in danger versus securing our border.
Mm-hmm. And it's difficult for us. I think the big thing is that we get asked from DHS to support the Border Patrol mission, and we get put here on the river, and we just do our best to help people out. I think it's that same thing.
Most people never come to the border and have any idea of what's going on other than what they see on TV or read. What would you like them to know, or what would be enlightening for them to know about what's going on now?
I think the biggest thing that I could pass on from the Coast Guard perspective is that we're here to save lives. Está bien. And we see a lot of people coming over in austere conditions, and you have to empathize with them. I mean, it's a rough journey for a lot of people.
Está bien? Estoy bien. Todo bien. ¿Tú necesitas agua? No?
We're here to help them and make sure that everyone stays alive.
According to reports, the Coast Guard is part of a government task force hoping to better monitor and anticipate the movements of immigrants heading to the U.S. to illegally cross the border, as nearly 30,000 Haitians did in Texas last month. When we come back, a look at what's ahead next week on Full Measure. Coming up next week on Full Measure, billions in COVID relief have gone out the door. Wait until you hear what a top watchdog says he sees in terms of supersized fraud.
We started to track what the fraudsters were actually saying. Bombard them. Throw as many at the wall as possible, and some will get through.
We follow the money to COVID fraudsters costing America billions next week on Full Measure. And if you want to hear more stories, check out our podcast, Full Measure After Hours, on your favorite distributor. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.